Albie Amankona, political commentator. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you are keeping well. Just under 3 years ago, people voted for the Conservative Party in the 2019 general election, not just to get Brexit done, but also for low taxes, for no rise in national insurance, VAT, or income tax. However, the government has increased national insurance by 1.25 percentage points to help fund social care. Whilst no one could have predicted the pandemic in that 2019 manifesto, the national insurance rise has gone against the party's brand of low taxes. The UK currently now has the highest tax burden for 7 decades at 36% of national output. Have the Conservative Party lost its economic direction as a party? Are they still truly conservative?
In short, after the pandemic, I think the party has lost itself in a lot of different directions, not just on its economic direction. Some would argue also on its moral direction and ethical direction, believing in things like the rule of law and equality under the law. You know, there are so many things which have contributed to the position which we are currently in today, and taxation is just one of them. Some might argue it's maybe the least offensive one of them, but it is one of them nonetheless, and it's one of the things that actually attracted me to the Conservative Party in the first place. This idea of, you know, financial freedom, that you and I and voters know how to spend their money better than the taxpayer, and that actually when you have lower taxation, businesses boom and they grow faster, they create more jobs and the economy grows. So we raise more money from taxation and then can pay for better public services. We've lost the ability to make that argument post-pandemic, and I'd really like us to get back to a point where we can start making that argument again.
Because a recent poll actually found that 49% of 35 to 44-year-olds actually think the Labour Party stands for low taxes. And as we know that as well, corporation tax, or tax on businesses, is also increasing under Boris's administration to 25%. Economic theory tells us about the trickle-down effect, and businesses reinvest profits to drive growth and expansion. This is going so far away from the party that, as you said before, me and you know, we've known for a long time.
Lower taxes lead to more economic growth, which leads to more money for public services, which means better public service outcomes for you and for me and for all voters, regardless of whether you vote for Labour or Conservative, is no longer an argument we can make when it's the Labour Party, as you highlight, that is seen as by many people in the population as being more economically competent, is the one that's saying that we shouldn't be raising national insurance contributions, is the one that's saying that we should be cutting business rates. So we've ended up in a weird situation where actually you have the Labour Party and Reform UK, who seem to be closer to each other when it comes to cutting taxation, and the Conservative Party, who is standing firm on its tax raising agenda. We can understand why it's happened though, David. You know, there's been the pandemic. I think we spent something like almost half £1 trillion on our pandemic response. Now we can talk about that response, but that's a completely different conversation. We do have to pay for that, but does all of it have to come from increasing taxation to this high level and stifling the economy, or can some of it come from tax cuts, which actually then deliver growth, which can help us pay for all of the public services that we enjoy?
Because history tells us that governments that raise taxes are punished at the ballot box. If you look at Gordon Brown and John Major, after they increased taxes, they went on to lose their next election. But at the same time, there is a trade-off, because inflation is at its highest level since March 1982 at 9.1% for the month up to May. We know that the Bank of England wants inflation at 2%. So there is this trade-off, because monetarist tools are being used to increase interest rates. Some economists are saying that interest rates might need to rise to 3.5% by next summer, but we are experiencing stagflation. The Chancellor has said that he's going to bring in this income tax cut in 2024. Bearing in mind the current inflationary pressures, is it right to wait to 2024 before bringing this tax cut in?
I think he will need to do it sooner than 2024 if he can. Rishi Sunak is a politician that I have a lot of time for, despite all of his shortcomings that we have seen lately. As a conservative, as an individual, he's a very successful and prudent and intelligent man. And I always like to think he's doing the right thing, but then with some of the decisions that he's made, with this income tax cut coming in 2024, I would assume it might come just before the election to give us a boost, and God knows we need one. But I think people need tax relief a little bit sooner than that. This government raised more tax or the same amount of taxes in 2 years as Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did in 10.
Yeah.
That was a Labour government. This is a Conservative one. In our manifesto, we said we wouldn't raise these taxes. We have.
It's really difficult because is Keir Starmer, talking about the Labour Party briefly now, is he really cutting through with voters? So we know Keir Starmer is probably still a socialist. When he was young, he was part of East Surrey Young Socialists. He probably isn't as left as Corbyn economically, but no one really knows because the Labour Party haven't actually told us or given much substantial economic plans or policy ideas. Like, I think the Labour Party, Keir Starmer hasn't ruled out maybe targeting higher earners, rolling out a 45p income tax hike on earners over 150,000. And he's also said about maybe targeting middle classes with tax rises on dividends and shares. But is there much evidence really of knowing what they stand for in terms of economic policies at the minute?
No, I don't think there is, but we do know that they tell us that it's different to what Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell stood for. And then they do dangle, we don't want to raise national insurance contributions. We think now is the wrong time. We think we should be cutting business rates. We think we should be looking at some wealth taxes to raise revenue and reforms to capital gains tax, etc., which is, to be honest, relatively unoffensive compared to some of the tax rises that we've seen from the Conservative government across broad spectrum taxes like national insurance and then corporation tax. So I always find it quite difficult now when you hear Conservatives making arguments like, oh, if you have Labour in power, they'll just raise your taxes, without referencing the budget that happened in March this year, and indeed the budget that happened in March last year. So I'm not going to sit here and attack Labour for their tax policy when I'm not happy with our tax policy.
Yeah. We've also been hit by strikes this week. Up to 40,000 staff working on railways and trains have taken part in this week's strike action over pay and conditions, causing massive disruption to everyone's working day life. Lynch has told LBC that he's looking for a rise of 8%. Has the government taken the right approach on how it's dealt with the strikes so far?
There is a better approach, because the better approach is that we come to some sort of agreement where the strikes aren't necessary, and that hasn't happened. But the government's in a tricky position because really the negotiations on pay should be happening between the employer, i.e. Network Rail, and the employees, i.e. RMT, ASLEV, and the other unions that make up the railway, that represent the railway workforces across the country. And they've not been able to come to an agreement. You've got on one side the Network Rail bosses saying they just simply don't have enough money to give them these, 7-8% pay rises that they want. I think they offered 3 or 4% this week, which is obviously still quite a bit of distance there. Added in there, you have the Merseyrail workers who have recently been given a 7.1% pay rise by the Labour-led council in Liverpool, which makes things a lot harder for Network Rail, because now the RMT can say, well, look, if this is what workers can get in Liverpool, why can't they get it in London or in Edinburgh or in Manchester and all around the country? So we're in a very difficult position, but I think it comes back to what I was discussing earlier about growth, really. And we've got to be fair. There has been wage stagnation in the public sector for 10, 12 years, or even longer, since 2008. So we can understand why people are striking when they've had wage stagflation and now there is inflation. So actually, relatively speaking, their wages are going to be going down. So I could understand absolutely why Mick Lynch is doing what he's doing. But I want the government and Network Rail and the Mick Lynch-led RMT to come up with a realistic way forwards, because if Network Rail doesn't have enough money to give them a 7%, 8% pay rise, then they don't have enough money to do it. So they're going to have to find something in the middle.
Because you hear people saying about an inflationary spiral, if the pay rises are accepted, and it could cause like firms hike wages, and then they pass the cost on to customers through higher prices. British Airways now are also saying that they're going to strike this summer, and teachers as well. There's talk of them going on strike. But this is what most of Thatcher's premiership was about when she was elected as Prime Minister. The UK was experiencing double-digit inflation. Trade unions were powerful. Most of her premiership was about tackling the unions and fighting with the unions to reduce inflation, and she did reduce inflation at her time, and her belief in free markets and reducing state intervention and reducing the power of trade unions transformed Britain. Do you think there could now be a summer of discontent? The start of these strikes, do you think this could be the beginning of something happening over the next few months?
I think there will be a summer of discontent. I think that's quite clear from what we have been seeing. And until resolutions are found for the RMT, that is going to continue. And of course, if they give the pay rise that the RMT wants to the RMT, then that will have a ripple effect into other unions, as we're already seeing. You know, teachers, barristers, etc. across the country. It could get really difficult. And I think it could become a significant wedge issue for the government, and it could work quite well for them with the Conservative base, you know, a Conservative Prime Minister going up against the unions. But you see, the problem is, David, is that we have at the head of the union movement at the moment, let's say it's Mick Lynch for the sake of argument, someone who is very effective, very effective media performer. You know, I was on Politics Live with him earlier on this week, and I was incredibly impressed with how he came across. He's made mincemeat of every politician that has come up against him, Labour or Conservative, of every journalist that has come up against him, right the way from, you know, someone like Piers Morgan on the more sort of opinion-led news front to you know, a Joe Coburn or a Richard Madeley on the more traditional news front. He's a very effective media performer, and he's just an ordinary working class guy who's done quite well. And this is talking to the same parts of the electorate that our Conservative Prime Minister wants to speak to, but Mick Lynch is able to do it much more effectively because he's not got all of the nonsense of Partygate and tax rises and all of these investigations around him. And so I think maybe actually in terms of communication, the government needs to take some notes from Mick Lynch.
As Keir Starmer, he's sat on the fence on this issue. Like, he's told Labour MPs not to appear on the picket line. Angela Rayner, despite not appearing at the strike, she said she did tweet her support for the RMT workers, saying workers have been left with no choice. The Labour Party is clearly divided on this issue. Has Keir Starmer, looking back on it now, has he dealt with this issue well?
No, he's not dealt with it well, because no one really knows where he stands on the issue of whether he supports the strikes, doesn't support the strikes. He tells, you know, members of the Labour front bench and indeed backbenchers not to go to the picket lines. They do go to the picket lines. It all just seems like a massive mess. And if there's one thing that gives me hope, it's that I think the Labour Party looks like it's in more of a mess than the Conservative Party is. Now, picking the lesser of two evils is never a good choice for the British people. And I desperately want us to get to a point where we are providing coherent arguments on tax and growth, and on how we're going to solve the cost of living crisis, and on how we're going to resolve the strike so it doesn't damage the economy more than it's already been damaged. I mean, you think about these businesses, you know, hospitality, events like Glastonbury, Armed Forces Day, all of these events that people are doing again for the first time since the pandemic, being disrupted by strikes.
Children have been able to go to school to do their exams and been sleeping on floors, like hospital appointments have been cancelled. And I think 45% of the public are against the strike action. So there are a lot of people that are just so frustrated about this, as you said, about after the 2 years of the pandemic that we've just been through. The last thing people want is more disruption to their lives. And finally, Albie, the by-elections have happened this week. For the Conservative Party, they've lost both of the by-elections in Wakefield and in Tiverton and Honiton. Tiverton and Honiton turned Liberal Democrat for the first time ever. It had always been Conservative. Oliver Dowden resigned yesterday, and now there's talk of what is going to happen next to Boris. Like, do you think Boris can survive this next few months?
That's a difficult question, David. I'm not sure if Boris can survive the next few months. I do sense that something has changed after the 2 by-election losses, despite the fact I think most people predicted we were going to lose them anyway.
Yeah.
I certainly, on Friday morning, I felt very sad about the situation and actually quite emotional about it. And I just thought something has got to change. It might have been Oliver Dowden, because I wasn't expecting Oliver Dowden to resign.
Yeah.
And Oliver is a Johnson loyalist through and through. You know, he was one of the 3 up-and-coming Tory MPs at the time back in 2019. It was Oliver Dowden, Robert Jenrick and Rishi Sunak who got behind Boris Johnson's leadership campaign and said, this is the man to take us into the next general election. Now, speaking about the next general election, they were right. We obviously got that around 80-seat majority at that 29 general election. Everything was looking good post December 2019. COVID threw a big spanner in the works. But I think the behaviour of the Prime Minister and the enablement by Boris loyalists in the party and in the cabinet of him to get away with things which actually, looking back on things, he shouldn't have been able to get away with them, has led to a point now where potentially the damage which has been done to Boris Johnson is irreversible. I think the by-elections proved that everything the Conservative Party has done since November, with this really kicked off, and then it just seems to have been getting worse and worse and worse. Every measure that the Conservative Party has taken to get back on track has not worked.
Because you've got Michael Howard, the ex-Tory leader, calling for Boris to resign and to change the rules to the 1922 committee. But the Tory vote, I think, in Tiverton and Honiton collapsed from 43% to just under 20%, and nearly 20,000 voters stayed at home. Is it just the fact that these voters just didn't want to turn out, and maybe at the general election they will vote Conservative and this seat will actually go back to the Conservatives?
I think that's the core issue that the party needs to diagnose, is why these voters stayed at home. Is it because the weather wasn't good? I'm not sure, because I think the weather was quite good on Thursday, actually. Is it because they feel disenfranchised by the political situation, by a Conservative Party that they don't see as Conservative because of what we've been doing on the economy and what we're doing about raising taxes, and how, you know, some may argue that our leaders don't have a respect for the rule of law, you know, 2 core Conservative principles, the rule of law and lower taxation? Or is it another reason? So we need to diagnose why those voters stayed at home. And as long as those Conservative voters are staying at home, it leaves the park wide open for other people to come in and clean up the field.
Well, Albie, thank you so much for the interview today. And it's going to be very interesting to watch over the next few months to see what happens in politics. And I'm sure we'll be following it closely. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David.